Okay, welcome everybody today. My name is Daniela Caruso. I direct the Center for the Study of Europe in the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, and I also teach at the law school. So today it is my pleasure to take a close look at some of the experiences in Europe concerning the settlement and resettlement of refugees. We have a particular geographical focus today. We are focusing on Italy and Spain. The ambition, the plan is to have additional series, like additional episodes in this series, the next one on Greece and Germany. Please stay tuned. Now, the speakers today, the panelists, which as you will see soon are all linked by one common theme and interest, are first, Olivia Britton, Manuela Consito, and Dorothy Estrada-Tanck, with Professor Susan Akram as primary discussant. And we'll then open it up to conversation after their presentations. Feel free to send questions for the attendees in the Q&A question. And actually, I think we can unmute you if you have a question. So we'll see what we can do in a bit. For the time being, let me briefly introduce the speakers today. So Olivia Britton. Olivia is a PhD candidate in political science and a National Science Foundation graduate research fellow at Boston University. Her work examines how different integration approaches affect refugee populations and shape their experiences in their country of resettlement. Olivia has done extensive fieldwork in Calabria, Italy, where she researched and analyzed the impact of neoliberalism on the policies for refugee management. As the recipient of a Fulbright grant, Olivia will spend the 2021-2022 academic year conducting research on refugee resettlement in Italy and Spain. Then we have Manuela Consito. Manuela Consito is Associate Professor of Administrative Law and a member of the board of the Human Rights and Migration Law Clinic at the School of Law of the University of Turin, where she received her PhD in public law. Manuela is interested in social assistance services and healthcare systems. Among the topics of her numerous monographs are the rules governing the migration of professionals, the accreditation of social and healthcare services, and the administrative legal issues arising when a country receives asylum seekers. Dorothy Estrada-Tanck is Professor of International Law and Director of the Legal Clinic at the University of Murcia, and a member of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. Dorothy holds a PhD in law and an LLM in comparative European and international law from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. Dorothy also holds academic and professional experience in the UN, Inter-American and European human rights systems. Professor Susan Akram, my colleague, directs the BU Law International Human Rights Clinic at the law school. Her research and publications focus on immigration, asylum, refugee, forced migration, the human and civil rights issues, with an interest in the Middle East, the Arab and Muslim world, and now also the European world. Her presence is particularly important today as she has been awarded a Fulbright Fellowship, which will bring her to work in Spain next year at the University of Murcia. Without further ado, Olivia, will you please take the floor and introduce us to your research? Thanks.
Okay, hello everyone. Sorry about that. My name is Olivia Britton. Aforementioned, I'm a PhD candidate here in the Political Science Department. So today I'm going to be presenting to you my work that I did as an undergraduate at Union College, which set the foundation for my doctoral studies. So without further ado, also, I just wanted to take the time to thank the Center of Europe here for having me today. So thank you. So to get started, in 2015, over 1 million refugees made the difficult decision to leave their homes in countries plagued by violence. A plurality of refugees were from Syria, a war-torn country facing civil strife for the past 4 years, which started as an anti-government demonstration during the Arab Spring. So the recent influx of refugees has provoked Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. So members of the European Union individually and collectively struggle to find a solution for this massive influx. So as mandated by the 1951 Refugee Convention, all states are required to provide admission and non-refoulement and to an extent social inclusion. However, protection varies widely across states, as some countries confront a disproportionate burden of refugees due to the lack of solidarity. So with that said, some states have argued that the incoming refugee population has overstretched their welfare system and national security systems to excuse the incompetence in fulfilling the needs of the humanitarian crises. So moving forward, so while some European leaders have pushed an anti-immigrant platform, some politicians and community leaders in Italy's impoverished southern region of Calabria have sought to both create and manage cooperatives for refugee accommodation. So historically, local governments have been responsible for settling and integrating asylum seekers. I'm just gonna do that. Okay, good. And mayors across the region of Calabria are embracing this responsibility in a big way. So you see these messages of neoliberalism messages, like reviving these fading towns, and they're thriving. So in the headline, it's apparent that these market incentives are pushed to sell the idea of hosting refugees. But if you can sell, you can also buy. So their eagerness sheds light to a lesser known reality that migration is a business. Okay. So while Calabria appears to be a beacon of hope for refugee resettlement, given the market function appeared most appropriate for refugee management, these lived experiences may reveal a different story. So as contemporary forms of humanitarianism continues to emerge, individuals are increasingly compelled to understand, depict, produce spaces, people, and relationships through market logics and value processes by neoliberalism standards. So this implicitly transforms refugees into economic subjects, nullifying their political agency. So I reviewed the literature within two lenses, from a neoliberal framework and a rights framework. So I looked at the work of Haskell's Capitalism and the Origins of Humanitarianism Sensibility, and Harvey's A Brief History of Neoliberalism. So humanitarian relief was once deemed an action outside of politics. However, refugee resettlement is not rooted in rights and compassion for the human condition, but it is deployed by the political and economic interests. So in part, this is due to neoliberalism, which is often like trying to talk to a fish about water. So we define it as, well, these authors define it as humanity activity in terms of consumerism, which favors private industry and market solutions to all of humanity's problems. So in the case of humanitarianism, neoliberalism has transformed this non-economic field of managing refugees into a promising outlet for entrepreneurs to practice market principles in the wake of populations' adversities. And then I looked at the contrast of the rights framework, because you have the 1951 Refugee Convention, you have the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, and there's this guarantee that basic human rights and physical security should be extended to those of refugees, similar to the rights of citizens. And so you have economic and social rights, which also should be extended to refugees, and including access to shelter and basic infrastructure and food and schooling and the right to work. So I find that I'm more aligned with the rights framework, and I critique the neoliberalism framework because the surplus of economic opportunity from hosting refugees actually reduces refugees to their economic capital, and which I suspect in the beginning tarnishes the quality of service provisions and neglects refugee rights. So this thesis was divided into two parts, where the first part I contextualize how refugees can be commodified through neoliberalism, specifically analyzing media coverage of these humanitarian relief projects. And then part two, which I guess combines 2 and 3, for as you see here, provides visibility to refugees' own voices and perspectives to fill the gaps of media narratives that lack true depiction of refugee narratives. So my case study is in Kamini. It is located in the Calabria region. This village lost most of its citizens to big cities due to job shortages. Locals fled, populations dwindled, and turning the village into a dying town. So the crisis did bring about change to the village because a member of the community is a beneficiary of the SPAR project. In English, it's translated into the protection system for asylum seekers and refugees. And this is a government funded initiative supporting community leaders to conduct local projects and reception activities for asylum seekers and refugees. So my research is qualitative in nature. It's rooted in interpretive science as I draw from thin descriptions and create thick ones. So this thesis draws on my fieldwork conducted over 3 weeks in Kamini from November to December of 2017. And I turn to these select processes to document these local initiatives for refugee management alongside refugee experiences. So participant observation, I volunteered with the social cooperative. I participated in a wide array of activities, working with refugees on resume building, working with refugee children during homework help, and having a more intimate setting with refugee women. We had a women's night, and so that was what I was mainly in charge of. So these interactions facilitated, were able to build this rapport necessary for my next methodology, which is Photovoice. So this research approach allowed me to acknowledge this population's own voices through photography. So it recognizes that people are experts of their own experience, enabling the audience to literally see the world from which the outlook and values of the peoples whose insight is frequently neglected. And as a universal tool in acquiring insight into participants' lives, imagery is able to transcend those language barriers. And then finally, I turn to photo elicitation, which I follow my Photovoice methodology with, which allows us to discuss the meanings of their photographs. And images serve as a departure point in understanding participants' perceptions. It also accesses participants' tacit consciousness or thoughts they may be reluctant to share otherwise. So my research approach enabled me to access families' candid testimonies and photographs, which repeatedly conveyed their lack of options. So one of them includes inadequate living accommodations. So these families often had young children, and this is a photo this family took, and stairs were a really big safety hazard to them, where they communicated with the cooperative that this was unsuitable for their young children, and they had a 4-year-old, they had 6, 7, and 8. And actually in this photo that I blurred to protect privacy and confidentiality, he actually had a black eye because he tumbled down those stairs, and the cooperative assumed that the mother had abused him, when in reality, he fell down those flight of stairs that they had complained to the cooperative about. And that's his younger brother on the rails that the family took a picture of him also playing on the stairs, which he's also susceptible to the same kind of danger that his brother, same kind of danger. And then also heating. So this is also extremely dangerous. This is their one source of heat, and it didn't have a safety break to it, which they were also extremely concerned about. And this is a little uncommon because there's also heating diffuse systems within Italy. So having this one source of heat becomes really hard for a family of 6 to gather around, especially during the winters. And I could say for myself, when visiting during the winter months, it got really cold. And also cold showers is another thing you have to take into account for because of gas and such. And so with that said, heating is essential to making people feel comfortable during these cold winter months. And also the lack of access to drinkable water. These families would have to go make time out of their day to put it into their baby carriages and to recyclable. Some of them weren't recyclable, sadly, which is also a safety concern, a health concern, and how they had to go fetch water. And a lot of houses do have drinkable water, but not in this case. So then there was also limited shopping and substandard groceries. So this is a photo a family took of their grocery store. So they're only allowed to shop at this grocery store once a month. because this is the only time the cooperative is willing to take them. It's also a 15-minute drive, so they have to rely on the transportation of the cooperative. They don't have cars. Buses cost 2 to 3 euros, and imagine if you're taking your family and you're only allotted 20 euros a week from the cooperative. So you're going to spend your money wisely. And so this is a problem where a lot of local shops do not wish to allow governments to control their prices of their products. So this is probably a contract between CONAD and the Italian state for them to use the vouchers there. And so imagine having your family of 6 and only being allowed to go grocery shopping once a month. So in the second photo on the right, you see that how they bulk up for the month, and whatever you get is what you're going to have to last on. And also with the voucher system, you're not allowed to roll over with your pawns. That's what they say. Whether you use it, it's done for that day. So finally is the lack of job security. So in this photo, this man documents he's unemployed, and this was by choice, not by choice in the sense that he was a carpenter before and he decided to join the workforce here, but they weren't paying him what he was worth. And so he has a work permit as a refugee, and therefore we have to look further into the labor laws because he's allowed to be protected, and therefore he can't be discriminated against or receive less pay than his colleagues. So he kind of wanted to show me these photos because he believes that he has a different background and perspective that can be beneficial to working with others and collaborating. So he's very crafty. He uses his olive pits to make bracelets, which he carves into and creates those bracelets. And so it's just one of his skills, and he would love to immerse himself within the workforce and be able to be autonomous and make money for his family. And so this isn't uncommon within the cooperative. Actually, the Italian Ministry of Interior explicitly states that job service do not represent a specific obligation to which SPAR projects are held. So actually 62.9% of beneficiaries are experiencing job insecurity, which has hindered the autonomy of refugees. So with that said, my findings revealed that the lack of service provision sharply contrasts the town's economic benefit from the refugee population's presence. And so the crisis has brought about positive change to the village, which sheds light to the benefits of extending a helping hand, or in this case, market principles. But these principles placed upon refugees' lives has ignited this prosperous industry benefiting only the state and the entrepreneur. So as the governments disperse funds and transfer responsibility to opportunists, then local agents, there's a lack of oversight, which in turn leads to the neglection of refugee rights. So I hate to end on this note, but the Italian mafia has actually made use of the reception centers and has cheated the state out of $4 billion. So while this practice of, community and having this be the best approach for taking and accommodating refugees, in reality, it doesn't pan out the same way, especially within the refugees' favor. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for this field work and the results of it and the theoretical framework. We are going to hear more today about what it means to sell the project of settlement of the refugees to local populations. And we may see people aligned with your perspective and not. I really look forward to hearing more. And also, let's notice Olivia's question: what does labor law have to say about the access of refugees to the workforce? And why is it that they can be discriminated in pay when on obvious legal grounds they would be entitled to equal pay for equal work? Okay, so Manuela, Professor Consito, we can move to your presentation.
What I'm aiming to do today is just to give you a very general overview of what is the legal approach, and so what is the definition of the approach that Italian government is given to a migrant, dividing migrant in two categories. One is the forced migrant and the other is the so-called economic migrant, because as to the legal Italian system, the difference is still very, very important. And speaking about this, and also hearing underlying what Olivia was underlying, I have to underline that in Italian constitution, we have a huge, big principle that recognizes the right of asylum. And I know that it is not so common. That's why I want to stress this particularly, because the approach to those who are asylum seekers and who are aimed at obtaining recognition of their ask for protection is written directly in our constitution. As you can see, our article 10 of Italian constitution states that a foreigner who in his home country is denied the actual exercise of democratic freedom guaranteed by the Italian constitution shall be entitled to the right of asylum under the condition established by the law. This is very important because only those who are recognized as forced migrants are entitled to enter Italy. So they are considered under a strict legal point of view, the only people who have the right to enter the Italian territory, no matter the Convention of Geneva, no matter if there are or there are not European directives aimed at protecting people. The Italian constitution protects people if they are claiming for protection, as long as they are able to prove that somehow in their own home country or in the last country where they lived, their democratic freedoms were infringed. So this is big aspect of our legal system, because all the measures that then the state is going to organize in order to provide services and also settlement for those who are recognized as forced migrants are devoted only to them, and with a big difference from the economic migrants. And I think that this is very important because according to the Italian law, no foreigner is entitled to enter. Every foreigner has to comply with rules governing the entry of our territory. The only one who's entitled to enter is the one who's claiming for asylum, once it is proved that he is or she is really in need of protection. This difference between forced migrant and economic migrant affects, as I was saying, the response that the Italian state and at the central government level and on the other side at the local level, the response in terms of reception of people. And so, given a very general overview, we must make a difference between what is detention, what is reception, and what could be integration. And integration is something that has to deal to what Olivia was underlying by speaking of measures that could be offered to people also in giving them eventually the possibility to work. And one of the other matter is to have a secure job. This is a different issue. In order to organize all the structure aimed at receiving the migrants, the forced migrants, we experienced, I would say, year by year, an increasing number of facilities that are aimed at detain or accommodate, we say that are accommodating structures for those who are not citizens. And specifically for those who are asylum seekers, but also who could be protected people. So those who already obtain the refugee or the subsidiary protection recognized, they could be detained in return detention centers. We have different level of centers, and to each center we relate different measures, which are administrative measures aimed at receive them and giving them the possibility of having a provision of a certain amount of services aimed at level by level to help them to enter the society and to be integrated into the society by giving them the possibility to enter schools, to enter training courses, to be able to enter in courses devoted to help them to learn Italian, and so on. So what we call the welfare system. And it's a system that it's really divided on these different levels. So when people are detained in return detention centers, they are more or less like prisoners, but with no not having ensured all the rights that prisoners are ensured. And then we have a temporary stay or assistance centers and center for first aid. Also, recently we call them hotspots, but the aim is the same, to give first aid. And then at another level, we have the so-called reception centers and centers for reception of asylum seekers. What are the differences? The detention is thought for those who are detained in pre-removal centers. So it is, and this is a very peculiar legal issue, it is well known in Italy that they are not officially detention center, but administrative holding centers of a person, because he's not officially a prisoner, as I was saying, is not a criminal, but he is considered as a dangerous individual. So the idea is that those people are detained only on a temporary basis, based on the fact that soon they will face a removal. But the fact is that the dangerousness of these people is not often assessed. Then we have the reception. The reception centers are for people who are asylum seekers, but also for those who have the status of refugees and of subsidiary protection, also for those who have humanitarian protection, because we give also this kind of protection. And we can make a difference between those different levels of reception. We have the hotspot, as I said, who are aimed only for first aid and identification, and they are state governed. So they are governed directly by the Ministry of Interior, also through agreement with cooperatives, etc. Then we have the so-called reception and detention for identification center, even if in those centers also asylum seekers could be received, and they are still state governed. And then we have the third level, which is then divided in other levels inside, which is organized by not centers, but by programs that are organized at a local level by municipalities. And the one that Olivia was talking about is one that could be somehow considered as an example of the third level. But here the problem is that on a real basis, if we move across Italy, we can realize that the response at the local level are very different, because there are many municipalities who prefer to organize this level of reception for those who are deprived of the basic income, and so of the basic food and clothes, to be received in this reception center, where they also can receive the so-called administrative measure in order to promote their integration and in order to help them to enter the society, to find a word, to work, a job, to learn Italian, to go to school, to be trained. But as I was saying, we can encounter some of these reception centers who can reach a number of more than 1,000 guests. And so they are very huge, big centers, usually located at a very more than downtown, I mean, isolated from the cities, very difficult for the people to move from these centers in order to exit also and to look for job and to reach schools and to reach also hospitals, etc. And then we have other hypotheses, especially here where I live in Piedmont. We have many experiences that were somehow supported by local municipalities in the mountains, where they promote projects that are aimed at supporting small groups of people. And under the law, both the hypotheses are considered a third level of reception. So both the one in a big center outside of the city, as well as the one in the small village where maybe the people have more possibility to talk and to live together in the community. And at the integration point of view, normally what's happening is that only where there are villages that are promoting those small groups reception, the integration is somehow evaluated. When we have reception of refugees in big centers, it's very, very difficult to promote real integration and to promote the possibility to enter the job market, for instance. If we switch to the other category, which is the economic migrant, it's totally different, because the economic migrant has to deal with the necessity to comply with all those rules that are governing the entry, and they are not entitled, they have no right to enter our country, so they have to apply for visa, and then they have to apply for a residence permit. But in order to apply for a residence permit, they must first sign an integration agreement, which is necessary. And it is articulated by credits. And as long as you are able in 2-3 years to reach the top, which is 30 credits, you will be considered as more integrated. On the other side, there are many reasons according to which you can lose credits. And if you lose all the credits, you will be removed. And then we have the last hypothesis, which is for those who are worker and want to enter really for work. They must sign, in order to have their residence permit, a residence contract, which is a contract, a private contract between the migrant and the owner of the facility where they will work, or the entrepreneur, etc., etc. So what I want to underline here is that it's very important to our legal system which category you are part of, in order to better understand what will be the response at administrative level of the different measures that are organized in order to really receive you and to give you some opportunities. And then I will close, but when Olivia was saying that according to the neoliberalism approach, the refugee is so like an economic subject, I have to say that when we analyze closer those projects that are promoted by local municipalities, we really see there that there is more welfare approach. But when we look at the position of those who are detained or received in those big migrant centers, there, well, we face a big exploitation of job which is unpaid. It's a sort of slavery. So I think that the difference in giving protection and also the administrative organization that is aimed at receive people, it's very important, because it could really affect the final position of the migrant when he is in Italy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manuela. So many layers, so many details.
Yes.
Thank you for the tour de force through a complicated system. Dorothy, please, from Spain.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm also going to share the screen. Yeah, perfect. Thanks so much, Daniela, and thank you to the Center for the Study of Europe for this invitation, and to everyone for being here. And as Daniela anticipated, I'd like to speak about the situation in Spain. And one of the advantages of going last is that I can build upon what Olivia and Manuela have said, which I think are all very interesting points and that actually feed into what I would like to explain today, divided into the legal categories of migrant people in Spain. So that is similar to what Manuela explained, because I think as well that it's crucial to understand the possibilities in realistic terms that migrant people have to access different types of rights, different types of social services, and the possibility to build or rebuild their life. That is highly dependent on the legal category in which people are placed. I'd like to also give a general overview of the situation and speak then about immigrant settlement in rural and other areas in Spain, and tie that into a proposal, which is the project that I have been working with together with Professor Susan Akram here today, and with an NGO that deals with migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, in general, also people at risk of social inclusion. And I will explain how we are planning to develop this. So just for those of you who may not know Spain so well, or who haven't been here, we see Spain in the map. Spain is composed of 17 autonomous communities that you see there on the screen. I am professor at University of Murcia, that you may see there at the center right, let's say, at the northeast side of the country. But a part of these 17 autonomous communities, I would ask you to also note the autonomous cities of Ceuta and Melilla that you see are geographically located in Africa. They are Spanish territory, Spanish jurisdiction, all the same conditions as any of the autonomous communities, surrounded by the territory of Morocco. So these are some of the main entry points of migrants speaking generically, into Spain and into the European Union as well. So here we have that description. Those 17 autonomous communities are divided into 52 provinces, within which some of the cities and towns that we have been working with are located. So to give a general overview of these legal categories and how do rights and access to social services and welfare state or neoliberal mentality, as has been said, fit into them. So in terms of humanitarian admission of human mobility, how is this managed in Spain? We see that there are four main categories that I would say that fall into what Manuela described as forced migration, right? So these four categories are not identified as what one could call economic migrants. Other authors call them survival migrants, but these are actually all, generically, we could call them forced migrants. So we have in the first place asylum seekers whose claims for refugee status are processed within Spain upon entry into Spanish territory. So this is once you are inside Spanish territory or at the borders. One of the features of the European Union, and I think this is common to all EU countries, is that asylum seekers cannot apply for refugee status outside of the territory of the state. So while other countries may allow for diplomatic asylum, meaning that people can apply for asylum in the embassies or consulates of a certain state that are geographically located in another state, here you can't do that. This has been a quest of different members of the European Parliament to say we should allow some form of humanitarian visa for people to be able to apply for asylum in Libya, in Syria, in those countries, and carry out their administrative process there, so that they don't have to do all the journey physically and then go into a state. And only then, once you've, if you're lucky enough, if you manage to get the money, if you manage to survive and go through a lot of countries to go in, only then can you apply for asylum. So that's a consideration to take into account in this overview. Second category applicants for subsidiary protection under EU law that Manuela also mentioned, whose claims are also processed from within Spain. That is, people who do not who do not fall within all of the categories of the definition of a refugee person under the 1951 convention, but that still may be granted a certain level of protection because of generalized situations of mass human rights violations or generalized dangers in the person's country, in the applicant's country. So we say you can't send back those people. They don't qualify as refugees, strictly speaking, but the EU has devised this let's say second level category of subsidiary protection. Third level is applicants for temporary protected status for humanitarian grounds. So they are not asylum seekers. They don't fit into subsidiary protection, but for humanitarian grounds, you don't remove them, you don't return them to their countries, but you give them a status of protection on humanitarian grounds. In Spain, this status has been given mostly to people from Venezuela because of the crisis there. And of course, there's a lot of migration from Latin American countries in general and from Venezuela in particular. So it's been granted in a majority to people from Venezuela. And finally, refugees, meaning in the strict legal sense of the term, people who have already been recognized with the legal status of refugees. So while, in the media and when we speak of human mobility in general, we may speak of refugees as, there's so many refugees from Syria that are entering Turkey or coming to the EU. But technically, though, all those people are not really refugees until they may deserve the status of refugee, but they are not legally refugees until they are recognized that status. Ergo, they cannot access the rights under the 1951 convention until a specific country recognizes and actually grants them the formal status of refugees. So when we speak of refugees in the legal sense in Spain, we are speaking of people who have applied for resettlement from outside Spain, but that are already refugees, that have already been recognized as refugees in another country. So the legal rules for each of these four, let's say, categories or four divisions of persons, of migrants, are different, and they are carried out by diverse national authorities, and people have access to different rights depending on each of these status and for a certain period of time that is different in each case. Now, all the other immigrants, migrants that under what Manuela explained, we could call economic migrants, all of them do not fall in any of these previous four categories. And if they have not regularized their situation, they are undocumented migrants, which is actually the majority of the migrant population in Spain. Of the migrant population, when we speak of economic and forced migrants, of course, there's a great deal of, let's say, regular migration, from the UK, from within EU countries and so on. But when we're speaking of people that are facing conditions of vulnerability, undocumented migrants are facing the greatest because they have no legal protection or very little legal protection. And here I'd like to build upon something that Olivia was saying, that while the Refugee Convention may be applicable to, let's say, the four first categories, and maybe number three, not exactly, not so directly, undocumented migrants do not enter under the applicability of the Refugee Convention. In theory, and if we look at international human rights law, not only the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but all 9 core human rights treaties, or 8 core human rights treaties, because Spain and Italy as well are not a party to the 9th treaty, precisely the UN Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. No EU state is a party to that 9th international human rights treaty. But all the other 8 treaties on civil and political rights, on economic, social, and cultural rights, on rights of the child, on elimination of discrimination against women, and so on, all of those would be or are applicable to everyone, and particularly to undocumented migrants. But there's, of course, a gap between international human rights law and what happens at the national level, because we see that people in reality on the ground are not accessing many of those basic human rights. So the terms resettlement and relocation have been used in the EU context to describe first resettlement, speaking of the transfer of non-EU nationals or stateless persons who have been recognized as persons in need of international protection to an EU member state. And relocation is the transfer of those persons either in need of or beneficiaries already of international protection from one EU member state to another. As of today, as of 2021, those two terms that were devised after the 2015, let's call it a crisis or so-called crisis of the massive influx of migrant people, and they were devised in 2016 by the European Commission to try to face this, or EU institutions in general. And we see that between 2015 and 2018, Spain resettled only 1,433 people and relocated 1,359 people, which is of course very far from Spain's commitment within the EU to transfer nearly 18,000 persons to its territory. So that those two categories as such in terms of legal taxonomies are not really being applied today. Of course, there's migration to Spain from many other sources. And these resettlement and relocation agreements in the EU are independent from the overarching legal framework concerning refugees. This is refugees specifically, not other types of migrants, which is the Dublin Regulation. The series of international treaties that since the 1990s have been agreed between EU member states to manage and distribute responsibility among EU member states concerning reception and integration of refugees, in this case, only refugees, right? Or asylum seekers and refugees. So there's different criteria as to how refugees should be received. The main one being, or the main one that has been applied, is that the first EU country to which the person, or through which the person enters the EU, that country is the country that has to process the application for asylum of the person. So, of course, the states of the South, and this is what we're talking about today, mostly or mainly Greece, Italy, and Spain, are processing most of these asylum applications. That's precisely why the agreements of resettlement and relocation were crafted after 2015 to try to reach a more fair and equal distribution among EU member states, although that hasn't really been applied or implemented in practice, as we were seeing with the numbers. Now, just to give you a general picture, we see here the increase of applications for international protection. This is how it's called generically in Spain, international protection, covering the 4 categories that I explained at the beginning. So asylees, refugees, subsidiary protection, humanitarian ground, also stateless persons, which would enter also under international protection. You see how in 2012, there were 2,500 or so applications. In 2018, 55,000, and in 2019, 118,000. Only applications for international protection. So here we are not counting in economic migrants, right? So only the people under those 4 categories, or actually the 3 first categories that I explained, because refugees already have been granted that status in another country. But we see that, of course, there's a backlog. It's very hard. Most asylum seekers are waiting for a decision on their status. But asylum seekers have the right to work after the first 6 months of their process. And so at least they can be integrated into the community on different levels. Undocumented migrants do not have a right to work in a legal manner in the country. They have to wait at least 2 years to be able to apply for a figure that is similar to what Manuela was explaining. Here it's called arraigo social, which means kind of your level of integration into your level of social integration. If you have lived here, what have you done in 2 years? without being able to work, without being able to work legally. So it's, of course, quite a contradictory scheme, right? Because you can't access legal work, but then you have to prove that you're integrated in the community to be able to apply for a regularized status. So it presents, of course, many problems in practice and many problems in terms of human rights. So just to give an overview, this is a project called the Missing Migrant Projects by the International Organization of Migration and other organizations. And we see here, the picture is concretely of 2018, where I just wanted to depict graphically. You see the circle in the middle in the Mediterranean Sea with 2,000, nearly more than 2,000 people dying at sea, right? So the crossing through the Mediterranean Sea has been qualified as the most dangerous destination for irregular migrants. Of course, the crossing of the border, for example, between Mexico and the US is quite dangerous as well. But in recent years, because of the increasingly restrictive measures of migration and the migratory policy of the EU and individual countries, this has become very difficult and, of course, more dangerous, and there's higher risk for women and children. Then the most recent data in 2020, there were only, if we could qualify as only, compared to 3,000 deaths a few years back. In 2020, 289 deaths because of COVID, because of course many people knew that if they would go, the borders were closed, they weren't going to be able to enter. So many less people even attempted the journey. And in 2021, so far, as of today, the data I checked today, 743 people have died. So of course, this is tremendously dramatic. These are appalling figures that I think we should also consider when speaking of migration. And just a few days ago, you may have heard or seen on the news that there was a massive entry of migrants from Morocco to Spain through Ceuta. So through one of the autonomous cities that I showed in the map at the beginning, more than nearly 8,000 people entered in the space of 3 days because of different problems and diplomatic problems between Morocco and Spain that if anyone is interested, I can go into later in the Q&A. But I just wanted to highlight this because it's I think, very illustrative of what Spain faces. Of course, violations in terms of the way people have been returned. Collective expulsions are prohibited, but this was done in these days. At the same time, huge challenges for the Spanish state and for the civil guard guarding the border. To give you an idea, Ceuta received in those 3 days the same amount of people that they had received in the 3 previous years in total. So it was, in a way, unmanageable and quite chaotic. At the same time, I also wanted to highlight that there were many expressions of solidarity, of care, of humanity from different organizations and from the civil guard and the military as well. So this is just to give you a picture and a feeling of the social context in Spain. So my last point, turning to possible proposals, how do we deal with all these different categories, with all these people, and at the same time, all these expressions of human suffering and vulnerability and need. So we have articulated a project together with the NGO Fundación CEPAIM that has been working with migrants for more than 25 years. And they devised 15 years ago a project called Nuevos Senderos, New Paths, which tries to integrate migrant people into rural areas mainly. So trying to connect the needs of local rural communities that have been abandoned many times by public policy and the needs and rights of migrants. So the proposal now is to expand that project also to asylum seekers, refugees, and the people of the first 4 categories that I explained. And we're trying to build on that project that has different levels of integration in terms of development, housing, education, training, health and welfare benefits. And we think because of these legal differences, that it could probably be more successful than Nuevos Senderos, which has been quite successful in integrating migrants. But since asylum seekers and refugees have even more legal possibilities to access right to work, right to healthcare, and so on, we think that mayors and municipal governments at the local level will be even more open to it than what it has been with Nuevos Senderos. And we hope that this can be inclusive and also holding a gendered and an intercultural approach. And there are some of the communities you can see on the screen that have been worked upon already. One of them is Murcia, in which we'll be receiving Professor Susan Akram in a few months. And we plan to expand that to other autonomous communities within Spain. And so just to conclude, we see these increasingly restrictive and exclusionary measures in the EU, but at the same time, and as Manuela and Olivia have shown, also at the local level, there are many reasons for hope, and you can kind of carve out legal spaces and work around the restrictions. And the project we are working on hopefully will build on this experience of very committed NGOs that have been working on the field for so long, and that we can actually expand these projects to try to cover the greatest amount of people possible under the greatest amount of legal categories that is possible. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. Okay, so we've gone full circle from the critique of the model of revitalizing little villages to the idea that perhaps it is still post-critique, still the way to go. Let's hear Susan about this or any other thing, please.
Yes, maybe I'll just start with a few quick reactions and put forward some additional ideas that we have been discussing over the last year, really. I think between Olivia and Manuela, there is a middle ground, perhaps. I certainly don't see integration as necessarily, resettlement and integration as necessarily such a stark tension between the rights and obligations under the refugee regime and capitalistic sort of motivations. I think that there have been models now that show us a middle ground. And I'd love to hear more. And I think Manuela illustrates this beautifully with the different levels in Italy of possible integration. And of course, that the real corporatization is in the large detention centers. So I think it's a sliding scale. And the challenge is to find that sweet spot that both grants rights, protects the social services at the level of a living wage, adequate housing, all of the international guarantees on the one hand, and at the same time creates economic incentives for communities to want to host more immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers. So that's, of course, the sweet spot we are searching for. And obviously that's going to find that model is going to require very fine-grained research on each of the elements that all of you have identified as critical to making it work on both ends, the host community and the migrants, refugees who are being resettled, integrated. And to come back to some of the models that have been in my mind as I've been thinking about this project, really what stands out is the Canadian experience of host community sponsorship, group sponsorship. And although that also has had its significant critiques, what is so fascinating about that is, number one, the numbers of individuals and communities that have been resettled, that have come right out of and parallel to Canada's resettlement quota, meaning there's an expanded pie, an expanded population that can be provided protection and permanent integration. So that's point number one. The second point has to do with the close connection that's developed through that process with the host community. And often you find like-minded communities, like one stark example is the entire Tibetan community that was hosted by a Tibetan community in Canada. And so there's an automatic cultural integration that also can take place. Now, that's not necessary, but it's a nice example of how this can work more seamlessly, where you don't have the cultural barriers that are often a problem in integration. So that's one model that can be looked at, and fitting it into the European situation. One of the striking elements that I've been thinking about is how, if there were host community sponsorship, that might be an added element to Dublin and overcome some of the barriers of the Dublin regulation. So if an abandoned area can put together the components that would allow an entire community to resettle or transfer in the Dublin parlance, we can have an enormous benefit that pushes the limits of Dublin until one day we can get rid of Dublin. I'm sorry, that's my that's my very considered conclusion. That has to go someday. It is a disaster. And really one of the reasons, to answer the question in the chat, one of the reasons for the high deaths in the Mediterranean. So those were some of the pieces. I also wanted to throw out that there are some interesting individual entrepreneur efforts that create new possibilities, like the Chobani yogurt experience. This wonderful CEO, Hamdi Ulukaya, who's a real sort of icon, who started Chobani in a remote area and hired all immigrants and refugees in the factory, and then turned over ownership to the members of the workforce. That is an incredible model for a rural community, and to be able to have sort of put in the seed resources to create these kinds of cottage industries, perhaps, but then turn ownership over to the employees, so that you don't have this outside corporate ownership that has all of its negative consequences that can destroy environment and the benefits of being in a rural area. So those are some of the ideas I wanted to throw out and get your reactions to.
Thank you so much, Susan. Yes, Dublin, for a while, since the enactment of Dublin, I have students in my seminars write papers on why Dublin makes no sense. And each paper tackles the problem from a different angle, and each paper achieves exactly the same, reaches exactly the same conclusion as Susan's. Going back to Olivia's presentation, right? So I have the feeling that we all would agree that Olivia's group was, or the group of persons that worked with her through the camera, through their voice, through their pictures, were people that would identify with the, in principle, the most protected category. These were Syrian refugees that had or that were fleeing persecution, and therefore they were the category of migrants that should have it the best, right? They should be treated the best in principle. And then we enter into the quagmire of Italian administrative provisions, the delegation to regional and local governments, etc., so that even for those who would be the most protected of all, the quality of protection can be quite variegated, quite diverse depending on which group you look at the granular level. So I think that the quest for specificity of inquiry is very important. I think that Susan's approach, let's see what works and why, and what doesn't work and why, even when on paper we have the best possible protection, that is, I think, very welcome. Then there is the issue of the economic migrants. How do we bring them into the same pool of protection as the others? That's a different story, right? So we need to proceed both research-wise and in terms of fieldwork with the assumption that even when the rights are there on paper, protected even by the Italian constitution as prominently as Manuela showed, even there, the level of protection is actually quite deficient in several areas. And then there is the question, what do we do with the economic migrants? And is that a situation in which, given the lack of agreement, given the political gridlock over whether we should include them or not in our economy, the mayors, the local governments can do more than is done at the central or even European level? So I would like to take some contributions from the participants, some of which are really very involved with these kinds of problematics in Europe. The question by Professor Schiadas is the question of the recent, has to do with the recent indictment by the Office of the UN Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights that wrote a report this month titled Lethal Disregard. Now, this report states that based on evidence, the recent increase of fatal incidents involving migrants in the Mediterranean is not a tragic anomaly, but rather a consequence, or a predictable consequence of concrete policy decisions and practices by the Libyan authorities in conjunction with the European Union and the member states and institutions. Now, the UN identifies for the first time the EU as an entity, besides the individual member states involved, which is directly responsible, even though only partially, for the deaths of migrants in the Mediterranean. Now, this points at yet another level of intervention, which is, of course, the possibility of indicting the EU as such for its role in doing too little and oftentimes too late for about the Mediterranean crossings. Comments on the possibility to find legal possibilities for bringing the EU to respond for its actions at the level of international law. And anybody in the audience, we would be happy, by the way, to unmute you if Elizabeth can unmute everybody, given that we are in a small crowd here. Okay, so we have the others.
Maybe I could just take a very quick stab at that. Since we've been working on migrant disappearances across the Americas, primarily from the Northern Triangle, and what we have been focusing on, because this has been more of the demands of the families, is a regional or a transnational approach to investigations, answers, and repatriation of remains. Families have been demanding that as opposed to criminal accountability because of the open wound that has been left in this search for the loved one. And so the thrust of our UN-facing advocacy has been to develop and establish a transnational mechanism for investigations, DNA matching, database, identification of remains, and repatriation of remains in a respectful way. Prosecutions are on the list, but they are not as high as the other elements. And I know that there is not yet a transnational approach in place in any other region of the world, that this one that's getting developed in the Americas is going to be the first. And there is traction already from our first hearings with the United Nations Working Group on Enforced Disappearances, that they are anxious to push this, both in terms of concrete results in the Americas, but also as a model for other regions. So the second piece of the work that we've been doing, that we're finishing now, is a mapping of the United States responsibility towards this problem. And I suspect that there is going to be more of a call for accountability on the American end than perhaps some of the other elements. So I just wanted to throw out the experience that we are having on that front as an initial response.
Dorothy, please.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Susan. Yes, I would agree with Susan, and I'll just give a few further considerations. Why, in terms of possibilities of legal or judicial accountability for this. And thank you, Professor Esquedas, for the question, because I was really taken aback and surprised by this very bold report of the Office of the High Commissioner, because as an Office of the High Commissioner, they had never said it like that. I mean, you see previous reports, for example, of UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights for Migrants, speaking about EU responsibility and so on, not only legal responsibility, but ethical and political responsibility as well. But that the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights as a whole, leading with this one voice, speaks of this in this report, I think is tremendously important, and symbolically, I think it's crucial as well for future efforts to say that this is to pinpoint that there is a direct causal effect between the EU's migratory policy and these deaths. As it says there, it's not an anomaly, there is a cause-effect relationship. So in previous years, different UN mechanisms at the two levels, UN human rights treaty bodies and then UN special procedures, as the working group on for enforced disappearances that Susan mentioned, or the group in which I have the honor to participate on discrimination against women and girls. At the two levels, treaty bodies and special procedures, they have held EU member states accountable in different of their quasi-judicial procedures. In the case of treaty bodies, for example, the UN Committee Against Torture, but those are individual cases, right? Where yes, some responsibility has been found against Spain or against France or against Italy. When you go to not quasi-judicial, but judicial mechanisms, and at the regional level, we have the case before the European Court of Human Rights that was resolved in 2017, the case of ND and NT against Spain, a citizen from Mali and from Ivory Coast they suffer or they experienced what is called a hot pushback, right? Without any legal procedure or anything, just expelling them precisely from Ceuta and Melilla. And in 2017, the European Court of Human Rights said that was a violation. Collective expulsions are prohibited, a violation of due process of law and effective remedy and so on. And sadly, in my view, in 2020, a bit over a year ago, the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights, because the Spanish state appealed that, the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights said there was no violation and that those migrants put themselves at risk and it was their own responsibility in a way for placing themselves in a risky situation. So of course, you can imagine the reaction by human rights scholars and the NGO community and so on. So it seems that we don't have a very hopeful precedent in judicial terms. The other case I wanted to mention is that an NGO called the Global Legal Action Network presented a case before the International Criminal Court, before the Office of the Prosecutor, against the EU as a whole. So not against any individual member state, but against the EU, kind of in the way that the report of the Office of the High Commissioner states. I think it's very hard that it will prosper legally and that it will be admitted, but it's something interesting to note. I mean, the International Criminal Court judges the gravest crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggression. So they are saying that part of the migratory policy and the agreement with Libya for the interceptions at sea and pushing back migrants before they even reach the territory of any EU member state, that and the deaths at sea constitute crimes against humanity. So even if it doesn't prosper, I do think it's very interesting that it's being framed as violations of international criminal law. However, since we see that it may be hard that they prosper, I completely agree with what Susan was saying in terms of looking for other measures, right? That yes, accountability is one of the issues in the checklist if we want to really try to address these issues seriously. But I think other issues go through necessarily, yes, changing Dublin regulation, but that, as we said, is only applied to refugees, but also changing the migratory policy at the EU level. For example, authorizing humanitarian visas and diplomatic asylum, as I said, or even humanitarian visas, even if you are not going to study an application for asylum, but for people not to be dying trying to get to these countries. That's one. Another is opening more regular channels. I mean, this happens because they are irregular. So if you would open more regular channels, then there wouldn't be such a huge need for clandestine travel and entry. So I think we really have to rethink the migration policy. And I think this report by the Office of the High Commissioner is a very good starting point to reset the terms of the discussion.
If I can, I just want to add a few words. Last week, it's just an example I want to give you. Last week, I had the possibility to speak with the president of our tribunal, who is entitled of those claims of people who were denied of the higher status of protection, which is the refugee status. And she told me that on one side, the memorandum of understanding between Italy and Libya had this big effect also on the number of claims that now they are entitled to solve, because the idea was to create this massive pushing back of people in Libya. And on a very and pure theory approach, if we analyze the memorandum of understanding according to our constitution, that could be so like a sort of a breach of our Article 10, because we don't ensure asylum by externalizing all the processes in the northern part of Africa. On the other side, she told me that as we faced an approach at the political level of a stricter legislation on the recognition of humanitarian protection, that the result is that at the tribunal level, they faced more than double claims in front of the tribunal. And because many people that were refused to for the claims of humanitarian protection, they tried to file a suit in order to obtain a higher level of protection. And now the tribunal is, I would say, more open in order to recognize at a larger way this protection, while before they were paying more attention to a case-by-case approach. And so, and third, she told me that many people that are coming from Libya are saying that they maybe come from Pakistan or Bangladesh on a basis of a sort of all-inclusive packages of travel. They pay an amount of 2,000 euros, something similar, because in Libya they sell these all-inclusive packages like something that is, well, you will find easily a way to Europe and a flight to Libya, and you will have to stay in Libya for a few days, and then we will organize a quite easy way to reach Europe. And this is in Libya, okay? But I do know that somehow Italy, as an, let me say, iron arm of Europe is supporting this, not only financially, because as Italy, we are also improving a lot the training of the Coast Guard, the Libyan Coast Guard, in order to have them to control the Mediterranean. So it's quite hard to speak about responsibility and accountability of one state and of the European Union. What we are facing now, and I think that maybe Spain is facing a similar situation, is, okay, but when we do really face such big humanitarian tragedies like the one you were, Dorothy, telling us before, where is Europe? This is the approach that states like Italy, I think Greece as well, and Spain, at a political level may have. And the response is, there is no Europe at the moment. And on the other side, the response is, okay, let's sign some personal state-by-state agreement. But I do have to say that the agreement, the memorandum of Italy signed a memorandum of understanding with Libya, a sort of a secret agreement with South Sudan, and another with Niger, who are underlying some ideas of protecting migrants there. But to be honest, they are made for the other reasons. And there are more economic and reasons that are aimed at pushing this kind of agreements. And I would say that the idea of signing this agreement in order to control migration is just a sort of a fading idea. I don't know how to explain it, because there are huge financial and economic issues that are somehow behind the veil of organizing migration and controlling migration in those parts of Africa. So it's I was also impressed by one of the news that I heard, that also Frontex, the European agency that aims at controlling the Mediterranean, somehow could be called for a trial because of torture or something like that. I'm not precise because I haven't the possibility to read this kind of claim, but I was impressed because it was the first time that a European agency is called as responsible as well. Thank you.
I think that part of the reasons why, I mean, I really don't know in which percentage, but I have the sense that the decision to postpone indefinitely the accession to the European Convention of Human Rights by the European Union has a lot to do with the possibility of facing precisely that kind of trial in which Frontex, an EU agency, would be on the stand on its own. Another question from Professor Calpuzos here in the chat has to do with the impact of local politics upon European Union decisions vis-a-vis Dublin, etc. To which I would add the reverse question, which is, what is the impact of Europe's stance on local policies? So when Italy, the Italian government takes the decision to negotiate a bilateral agreement with, not even an agreement, an understanding, etc., with Libya, in which way could Italy feel that that was the right thing to do and that it would not get in trouble for doing that, because somehow the European Union protects and wants precisely this kind of behavior, and in fact helps it more monetarily? Could it be that, so in other words, each of the two levels, the state and the European level, seem to thrive on the complacency of the other in the situation, voluntary or involuntary, intended or unintended, which means that the circle has to be broken, and it could be from the projects that you guys are directly taking off ground, it could be that the local is the place where one can start to break the circle, the vicious circle, which makes me very hopeful. Okay, so basically start with the phenomenon that Olivia has observed so keenly and see if something better can be done, so that instead of making it a neoliberal model win-win, we actually have communities that are indeed receptive at the local level. Because if we make the locals more receptive, then the politicians will have more room for maneuver, and so on and so forth. This is very utopian, But we got to start from something, because it is clear now that all the forces, all the levels are complicit in somehow pushing the status quo to eternity. That's my impression. Oh, Dorothy, please.
Thank you so much, Daniela, and thank you to Ioannis Kalposos for the correction regarding the intervention, or rather non-intervention, of GLAN in the case before the ICC. Thank you for that. And I agree completely with what you were saying, Daniela, and I just wanted to complement or add 2 points. So I think definitely local communities, and stressing and emphasizing the needs of the local community. So not only the rights of refugees and, you know, they are suffering and yes, we have to bring them in, but also that this is a situation in which the community can benefit as well. Not in terms, you know, not looking at it in a utilitarian way of, you know, let's resettle wherever it is convenient for us, these people. This is, of course, has to be done with great respect for the dignity of the resettled people. But I think if we can connect those two rights holders and needs and advantages of local communities, we can move around this dichotomy of national EU relationship that you were mentioning, Daniela. And the second thing is that it not only depends on political will or even on these circumstances, for example, of local municipalities, but also on external factors. And if we look at the context of COVID-19, we see how factors that were completely unexpected and that no one could think that were going to happen a year and a half ago have really changed the landscape. And specifically in migration policy, I'll give the example that before COVID-19, there had been many voices saying that we should close the centers of internment of foreigners, which are similar to what Manuela was describing, like the reception / detention, more closer to detention centers. This was unthinkable. What would you do with people that are potentially dangerous, or how would you follow up if they are irregular? COVID comes, and the 7 centers of internment of Spain were closed because you couldn't let people be there legally for so long. At the same time, it was unsafe to have. So what do? They arrange with the NGOs that they already have a relationship with in the network for asylum seekers that are not kept in centers. They are, let's say, free, or they are outside living in communities that are managed and by NGOs. And these were closed for many months. Now they have been reopened, but only until a certain limit of their capacity, 30%. And there are local judges, for example, in Canary Islands, that have said this center of internment cannot be filled more than 30% because the conditions are inhumane, because of health reasons, because of distance, physical distance that is necessary in these conditions. So I think we really, against this background, we really have to take advantage of this specific historical moment to rebuild certain things that actually can be rebuilt if we push hard enough, and if we give these examples of, you know, they were left free and nothing happened and there was no, you know, national security threat. So I think that gives us hope as well.
So this is a great note of hope on which to stop. We have to say goodbye. Manuela is going to be locked on campus if she doesn't leave right now. Thank you so much, guys, and we can continue online, and there will be follow-ups to this series. Major thank you to Olivia for being the new force into this army. I'd love to see you involved, and thank you for your core analysis. Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, Manuela. Thank you, Susan. Thank you to our participants. Let's build a network. Let's join the network of people who are working on this. Thank you.